Is your team ready to defend against the latest cyber threats? Validate human cyber defense readiness with Rangeforce. Sharpen your team's capabilities with a cloud-based platform that takes a real-world, continuous approach to cybersecurity skills development. Rangeforce empowers cyber defense readiness at scale, with hundreds of interactive modules, learning paths mapped to industry frameworks, skill assessments, and team-based defensive threat exercises. Visit securityweekly.com/Rangeforce to learn more. Customers want fast and frictionless digital experiences, yet also expect protection against breaches, privacy violations, and fraud. Drive engagement by optimizing security and convenience to attract and retain customers. Use the PingOne cloud platform to build, test, and optimize digital experiences. The no-code orchestration engine weaves together authentication, user management, and MFA, all of which can enhance security, drive engagement, and boost revenues. Visit securityweekly.com/ping identity to learn more. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms, which include Twitch and YouTube. All right, for our second interview today, Joseph joins us to talk about a real-world ransomware attack. He has 25 years of experience in enterprise security. It's a long time to do this gig. Is an advisor to governments in several critical industries, and is also a podcast host for the 401 Access Denied podcast. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited because I think this is an important topic to share. And there's a lot of lessons learned to go through the ransomware case that I'm going to share with the audience today. So I'm really excited, and it's great to be chatting with you again as well. So it's always fun.
Yeah, same. We talk a lot about the industry and products and things here. And as a former industry analyst, you talk a lot in theoreticals and hypotheticals. So it's always fun to have some real world examples. I actually spent a lot of my spare time studying breaches and doing kind of postmortems on breaches where we have good details available. So I love, and I used to be an incident responder, so I love a good incident response story.
Absolutely. And for me, one of the important things here is that it's really about kind of sharing the step-by-step, how everything gets connected as well. And very seldom as well, like yourself, I've done quite a lot of incident response and digital forensics. I've also, on the other side of the fence, doing penetration testing and ethical hacking. But for me, getting permission to share the experience, because very seldom do I get, we tend to sign these long NDAs that typically forbid us from talking about any aspects of the cases. But for this particular one, the actually victim wanted to share their story. They wanted to share their experience. They have asked me to remove certain aspects of it that would reveal location, company, and so forth. But they want to share the experience of the incident response, what lessons they learned, the attack techniques that the attackers used, what happened in the recovery process. And they wanted to share, so they want to make other companies aware of the techniques that's used so that they can avoid other companies becoming a victim like they did. And I think that's really important. I think we should be doing more of that. We should be doing more transparency and removing the sensitive things where possible. But the more we learn about how things connect, how the techniques is used, what things could have prevented it, what things could have discovered it much earlier, I think those are some of the important things that other companies will hopefully learn from today's session as well.
Yeah, and it's my wish that we get to the point to where ultimately sharing those kinds of details is required. In any kind of situation where human safety comes into it, be it maritime incidents, aviation incidents, highway incidents, things like that. We detailed incident reports are publicly available so that we can learn from these things, or at least available to the people that need to review them, so that safety measures can be improved. And we just don't have that with cybersecurity at this point. And I think, I don't know what it's going to take. I don't know if it takes bodies, to be blunt about it. But yeah, I do think we need to get there. And I love the fact that this particular victim wanted to share their experience so that others can learn.
Absolutely. So just going to give you some of the background. The particular ransomware case, it relates to the Krylock version of ransomware. So Krylock is the version 2 of what was previously called Cryackle. Cryackle was kind of around in circulation as a ransomware variant around, I think it was about 2017, 2018. And then after it was discovered to have a weakness in the encryption, it disappeared for a while. And then it resurfaced late 2020, where it basically came back in as basically an updated and improved version, which was Krylock 2.0. And of course, the weaknesses in the encryption had been, completely, been removed, and it had significantly improved, not just in its encryption capability, but also its performance. In regards to how fast it can encrypt a machine. A lot of machines I saw probably took around 3 to 4 minutes in total, and those were machines that had hundreds of gigs of data. So very, very fast, very efficient, and also looking at I did some dynamic analysis and some static analysis to determine some of the potential maybe command and controls or IP or encryption technology capabilities. But it was very, very difficult to kind of reverse engineer it. So it was very well developed and very efficient what it was actually doing.
Yeah, so I think you wanted to kind of tell this story from two different perspectives.
Right.
So yeah. So it's and also I think we should mention, this is a talk that you gave at RSA, and are you giving it again? Is that correct? Or
Absolutely. So this is a talk that I gave recently at RSA, and I'll be actually doing the talk again at InfoSec World 2022 in Orlando. So I'm actually, in September. So I'm really excited. And one of the differences that I do when I'm doing the talk is I give some context around it, but one of the things I do when I'm delivering it is actually I do the live demonstration. I actually take it from, the start right through to the end, and all the steps. I even share the details of the scripts that was used and the techniques the attackers used in order to elevate privileges, to move around the network, to discover sensitive systems, and ultimately deploy the ransomware itself. So I share all of these steps and details right from the beginning, right through to the end. And as you mentioned, I usually do take two different approaches to this particular talk. One is I show it from the attacker's perspective. And when the attackers come up against certain, let's say, aspects or blockers or challenges that they need to kind of evolve or work around. So I show kind of some of the steps that they took from that perspective. Also some of the methods for using for persistence. And then I also show it from the incident response perspective, because I think it's really important also to show how you can find what things to look for, what's the indicators of compromise, what was it like to collect the evidence. Because if you're thinking about when you're dealing with ransomware, one of the challenges that you have is that a lot of the evidence is actually deleted and encrypted. The attackers actually really look to make sure that the event logs are cleared, that they make sure that the logs, that the specific data has been encrypted as well. So typically there's very little evidence remaining. And I always compare it to almost being like given, as an incident responder, given a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and you've only got 200 pieces remaining, and you need to basically put all of those remaining pieces and try to understand what was the big picture, what staging machines were used, how did they move around the network. And it's very difficult, especially when you have very little evidence. So for me, it's one of the things I used, which was actually quite interesting, was I actually used the actually event log clearing event as the method to find the staging machine. So I actually took all of the data and I basically put it into log to timeline. So Plasso is a set of tools that we use basically for evidence gathering and correlating of events. So I took all of those and I specifically looked for the timeline, and I actually looked for the first instance of the actually clearing event log. And that's how I was able to create a hierarchy in the chain of events to find the staging machine. By actually using the event log clearing event to find that. So it was quite interesting, kind of some of the steps and some of the lessons learned. But this particular, the incident, when I gathered around 5 years of log data. That's how far I went back in order to do the investigation. And with that 5 years of data, what I uncovered was the actually attack started 7 months prior. So it actually 7 months before the actually ransomware deployment and delivery, the attack actually started, where it was basically, it looked like an access broker that had basically was scanning the internet, using search engines and scanning for different open ports. And they discovered an open port that they end up doing either. The actually particular version of the server was also vulnerable as well, but I didn't find any evidence of the particular vulnerability that was vulnerable to was the Eternal Blue. But typically, when you're looking at that, it tends to have some crashes or some evidence of instability. And I didn't find any evidence of that, but it did appear that more likely to being a brute force, or that the actually victim had a compromised password. So from that perspective, 7 months prior, from that 7 months up until where the attackers got hands on keyboard, there was only 3 instances of that credential being used successfully. Successful logon, and then it went basically quiet for a couple of months. Successful logon, then it went quiet for a few more months. And then 2 weeks prior to the attack, to the hands-on keyboard, there was another successful logon. And then it looked like the actually access brokers had then sold those credentials to other cyber criminals who then used it and logged on. Basically, finding that staging machine was critical because it was able to find some of the techniques and some of the tools the attackers used. One thing that was very interesting that they used was GMER. GMER is something we use basically as a security tool. It helps us find rootkits in the kernel, hidden drivers and filter drivers and mini filter drivers. What the attackers were actually using GMER for was to find what security products was running on the systems that they may not have seen running in the taskbar or running in processes that might be hidden. They were actually using that to basically look for what security products was actually defending, so that they could find what ways they could actually move around or stay hidden or not trigger those security products, or find ways in order to actually turn them off. So that was really interesting kind of aspect of using tools that we use for good that have been used in order to stay hidden as well.
Right. I mean, essentially, they're extra administrators at this point, so they're using administrative tools as non-approved,
not approved uses. It's for they're using it in order. Basically, they like living off the land. Very seldom do attackers want to introduce anything new, because introducing anything new will increase their potential detection or the defenders being able to discover something. So they tend to prefer to live off the land and use tools that basically would look like normal activity to any other administrator. Even PS exec was used in this particular case as well in order to move around the network. So this is something that they want to stay stealthy. They don't want to be discovered. They like to stay hidden for as long as possible, creating as little noise.
So on that point, before you go much deeper, let's highlight the initial access brokers here a bit, because I think that's part of understanding the business behind the criminal side of things here, in that you have these initial access brokers that kind of specialize in going out and getting that initial foothold, and then they try and auction that off, I guess, or sell that. But I think it might be a bit confusing to people to hear that the initial intrusion was 7 months and then nothing happens, and then all of a sudden the actual incident occurs.
Absolutely. In this, we estimated that there was 4 different criminal gangs that actually participated in this particular attack. You had one as the access brokers, who specifically, gained access and sold it on to other criminals. So they weren't necessarily the same ones that actually logged on to the computers. They just basically, found the credentials. And the expert, that's what they specialize in. And that's all they make their money off, is the access itself. The other group was the crypto creators, the ones who actually developed the Krylock. They were, sold it off. It was one of the first, it was one of the first ransomware variants that was more of a ransomware as a service. What they refer to as an affiliate program, where rather than them deploying the ransomware, what they do is they have a channel. They literally employ a channel who will give them back loyalty or financial return for successful ransomware victims.
A sales channel.
Yep, that's a sales channel for ransomware. And then also you had those who logged on to the systems and ultimately did the hands-on keyboard work. And then the other was also the ones who communicated. They employed help desk workers in order to actually communicate, because English wasn't their native language. So in order, they become basically a support team for them to want us communicate and help the victims, to verify that they can decrypt the data if they want to basically go down that path of paying their ransom, and also the communication channel. Sometimes the attackers are not in the same time zone, and they don't want to be basically, basically staying up their late nights. So they will have an intermediary do the communication for them.
To supply chain.
Go ahead, John.
I was just saying it gives a new meaning to supply chain, right? Like it's the diversity and what's actually tied together. It's I think in some cases, some of these organizations are getting more sophisticated than the enterprises are compromising.
I was going to say it gives new meaning to MBA, more like malware business administration.
Absolutely. We've even seen, crypto creators actually doing bug bounties now to find vulnerabilities in their own software. So it's also interesting, kind of the path.
I have seen that.
And they do have recruiting processes as well. And interesting, the organized crime and cybercrime groups, they don't require much certifications as well. So the path to that, direction is sometimes easier than getting into the industry. So it was always interesting. The thing was that looking through this case, it was always kind of, uncovering those little details and uncovering the very specifics of, the multiple groups that you're dealing with. It was also, getting into even negotiating. One of the things that the organization, it was an early Sunday morning when the ransomware was deployed, and at the same time they were actually extracting a large database. Unfortunately,
and it's probably not a coincidence, that timing, right? Early on a Sunday morning.
It was not a coincidence. Yeah, that was definitely something that they planned because it has the biggest impact, and very little people watching or looking at monitoring of logs or looking at events. So that's definitely a way to have the biggest impact when you've got very few people to be able to respond quickly. So that's one of the things that, and also how you discover. I find a lot of different cases how you discover your victim. And in this particular case, the attackers, they actually had the IT and security team's email addresses, telephone numbers, contact, social media information. They actually sent emails and SMSs to the IT team to let them know that they've become a victim. So they want you to know. Because ultimately that's how they basically let you know that they've got all the details and how much data they've been able to access as well, especially when it's the IT team's credentials that the attackers have access to and are using.
Wow, and they create that sense of urgency, right?
Absolutely, it's a sense of urgency, because once they notify you, the clock's ticking. And that's what's important. Is a lot of the cryptos, the ransomware itself. Once you actually deploy it, the clock starts ticking. So it's important, especially if the ransomware, the gang themselves who's actually deploying it, if they've obtained it from other locations like other malware creators, that once they deploy it, that clock starts ticking and they have no control over it. And that typically means that in 2 days' time, there's a negotiation of basically that you'll get a 50% discount off the actually ransomware. And then after 4 days, it's full payment. And then after a few more days after that, then basically the keys are gone. So that starts basically the severity of the impact, and time is so critical to respond. You have to respond. You have to start already, getting very, very quick response, within minutes. Literally, 30 minutes is ideal to really get all hands on board and responding, where you can actually make sure that you sever the connection, the active connection the attackers might have, rotating the credentials to make sure they can't return. And ultimately then doing, the investigation and finding where that, patient zero is to make sure you lock the door. Unfortunately for this particular victim, they had a backup solution, but the backup was on a flat network using the same credentials as production. So ultimately it was also online, meaning that when the attackers were able to gain access to the actually a domain administrator account, they were able to also encrypt the backup as well. So this organization ultimately was facing that their completely business was gone. The business that they had, the backup, production, all the customer data, all the financial data, and that means inventory of what you have in stock. You can't even pay your employees or pay your suppliers. You can't send out invoices to even get paid because all of that's gone. the business came to complete stop. They were at the point where basically they were looking at what paper they had to be able to continue providing services. So it was quite devastating. And they did go through the process of considering whether to pay the ransom or not. For me, we can go to events and we hear this from the industry so often, is to not pay the ransom, but we're not in the position to say that. We can only recommend it, but we can't enforce it. We have to get to the point where it's a business decision. And the business will decide whether they will go down the path of paying the ransom or not. And I think that's the right thing to do. And ultimately, paying the ransom in the end does fuel future, cybercrime, and it makes the problem bigger. But ultimately, it is a business decision. We can't interfere with that. We have to let the business decide what is their path to recovery. And it's our job to make sure either that we mitigate it for the future, that they don't become a victim again. That's ultimately what we're here to do, is reduce that risk. Fortunately enough, we very quickly, found that as I went through basically the inventory and all the details, and I did that going back 5 years of data, I was able to find that a year ago they had actually done a migration, and that migration was critical. It meant that we were able to go back to that system that was still available, that was 1 year old, that had been, basically it was a hardware migration and a software upgrade at the same time. And fortunately enough, that machine, which was due to be decommissioned, and just the team didn't have the time to do it, that it was still available. So we were fortunate enough that we used that as a baseline to recreate the business. And of course, we had to go through and do the migration again, do the software update. But it meant that the business had only lost 1 year's worth of data. Still devastating to the business, but that was something that they could use as a baseline to recover from. That was something that we then could go through all the paper receipts, what was left in email accounts, what was left in basically hard drives, and do a lot of data scraping. And it took them, I think it was around, ultimately, there was more than 20 plus people working on this particular incident, and it took around 2.5 months to 3 months to rebuild, to get that business back to a prior incident operational mode. But it would end up that particular, being able to find that 1 year old machine meant that the cost of the recovery was less than what the ransomware payment would have been. So they were quite fortunate. I would go to say they were actually very lucky that they did have some of the things, that was there to be able to have a baseline to recover the business. But ultimately, this was in the hundred thousands of euros of costs, where the ransom payment itself would have been in the millions.
So the overall timeline of this, so 7 months before the attack really begins after initial access, and then you said around 2.5 months for the recovery. How long was the actual investigation point from when the attack started to when you were hired and you got to the point where you had containment, eradication, and started rebuilding?
Absolutely. So basically, from the 7 months that the initial access, it was hands-on keyboard for approximately 15 days. So the attackers had hands-on keyboard, where they were enumerating, elevating credentials. They were able to find local administrator accounts that they were then able to disable the security in the system, lure a domain administrator to log onto that system, gain access to their credentials, ultimately elevating right up to domain admin. That process took around 2 weeks. So 15 days. After 15 days of hands-on keyboard is when they started extracting the data. And when they got the domain administrator, they had then basically, that was only a matter of hours before they deployed the ransomware. And they created multiple staging machines in order to make that deployment quite effective and quite efficient. So that was around 15 days. The incident happened within literally minutes after the ransomware started being deployed, and the attackers contacted the IT team directly to let them know that they'd become a victim. The investigation itself, I think my involvement was probably around total, I wasn't permanently on the case. I was more oversight and making sure that they had all the necessary tools and techniques and processes. From ransomware deployment to the recovery was around 3 months. And the incident response took around a full 2 weeks, 2 weeks of investigation to find out all the details, to lock the doors, to eradicate, So that was around a 2-week process.
And that's not a normal 2 weeks either. When you're going through that process,
clock. It is round the clock. It is stressful.
That's a lifetime.
You know, for the team. I mean, for me, it was a realization that when I start seeing burnout, you start seeing people getting post-traumatic stress. You start seeing people getting a really imbalance, and ultimately these types of incidents are when you start seeing people leave the industry. Which is unfortunate. And I think that when people's working in incident response, we really need to start thinking about the human element to it, which means that we have to think about psychology and therapies for the people who's responding to these incidents, because it is very stressful. These are people that's working on cases where they don't know they'll have a job at the end of it. Because in many cases, what happens is that there's human victimizing. Organizations prefer to have a human as a way to create blame. So these teams are working under very, very severe stress, round the clock. So you think about, it's from a 2-week period, it is the longest period that most people experience very, very stressful circumstances.
It's funny. This is our two guests today are sort of nicely aligned. I'm not sure if you're able to listen to a previous one, but a lot of what you've been talking through. He was talking from a threat hunter aspect of how he goes about actually trying to find some of these things and mitigate them before they happen, hopefully, versus you talking about the actual IR side of things. I don't know, not quite so much a question, but it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast. He actually seemed very, I don't know, Adrian, if you had this, seemed very laid back, and they talked about, we don't have metrics on what we're doing. We just sort of try and find like the new things coming up. And it was it seemed like a very nice working environment compared to, there's definitely something to be said for the adrenaline rush of being in that moment. But I can imagine if you're in it constantly, that burnout's a perfect word.
Yeah, no, I think. Yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
I was going to say, you definitely, if you're going to do it long term, you have to have a personality for it. I thrive off it. Like one of my favorite jobs was working in restaurants as a chef, and like you don't have a chance to go to the bathroom. Like nobody else works your station but you, and it's just however long that shift is, just 6 hours of just nonstop. And that just that feeds me. I love it, and I really enjoyed incident response for that also. But I did I learned a lot of the prep we had to do were for the folks that were not like that. A lot of the prep had to be, okay, like you've put in a shift, you need to go away and stop thinking about this, and understanding other people need to recharge. They have different needs, than people that kind of enjoy the adrenaline and being in this moment and can be calm and not stressed out in that moment.
Absolutely. It is very, one of the things I do recommend is in incident response, it is great to have a red teamer on the incident response team, because they really know what to look for. They can think like the attacker. They can look for the paths. So I think it's, purple teaming is a great way, but we definitely need, these teams to work together and come together. So definitely when you're doing incident response, having somebody who can think like an attacker and can follow those breadcrumbs and work their way back and finding out what's the possibilities of the attackers gaining access. That's so crucial. It's so critical. And those skill sets are very different. When you're looking at incident response and digital forensics, it's a very different, they're looking at logs, they're looking at building ports and understanding. But sometimes they don't have the mindset of the attacker. And I think it's so important. I did listen to a bit of the previous speaker, and it was great hearing some of the concepts. And I think having that cross-pollination, cross-knowledge sharing is so critical to really getting it organizations more resilient and better prepared.
And to your point, John, we do try to match up interviews that work well together. So our first interview today was, if you look at the cyber defense matrix that Sunil, you put together, our first guest was right of boom, and Joseph is left of boom. Or no, I got that reversed. Sorry. If you're looking at the matrix, left of boom is identification and preparation or prevention. before any kind of incident occurs. And then on the other side, you have detection, response, and recovery. So that
one thing I do want to, one thing I do want to share with you, Adrian, was that what was interesting when I was doing the investigation as well. You do uncover other things, which is always interesting. One thing that I did uncover, going back, was that when I mentioned I went 5 years back in the logs and events to do the super timeline. I did find evidence of other crimes in the business. Somebody had installed crypto mining software in the business, and that had been running for 2 years. So somebody who had access, an employee, had installed crypto mining software and had been basically, living off that for quite a number of years. And when we did the cost analysis into the power consumption, it was high. It was quite expensive. So that was one thing that was interesting that you do find. Of course, in my case, I document it and I pass it over and let the organization decide how they want to deal with it. But what was also very interesting was that when I was going through and I had the evidence remaining from the attackers, one is they had up to 5 different ransomware variants they could have chosen from. So they had a whole basically tool set of ransomware. But what they'd done was they'd done a lot of copy pasting in their scripts. And I was able to then find that in the actually logs and the evidence that I was able to get into, that I did find evidence of another victim. So for me, I thought it was quite interesting. So I got permission to go and contact this other victim. So I reached out. I thought it was proactive, as a good ethical hacker, to go and notify this other organization that I'm sitting looking at their, domain controllers. I'm looking at their, usernames and passwords and hashes. And I thought, I should do my due diligence and contact them. So I reached out and I contacted them. I said, hey, I'm working this other case here, and I find evidence of your data in this case. Maybe, have you become a victim of ransomware recently? And maybe you want to collaborate or, share indicators of compromise. And they responded very quickly and said, we are not a victim of ransomware. And that was it. And I thought, okay. Well, then I responded back and said, maybe this is a good time. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're about to deploy it. Maybe this is where you can stop it before it happens. So I said, maybe, you're actually lucky. Maybe you can start investigating and seeing.
Isn't that the first stage of grief? Is denial the first stage? Okay,
so absolutely. And ultimately, so I a second time I said, hey, and after that it went silence, nothing. And as after a period, it was 2.5 months later, and that came to the point where I had to then, take all my evidence, all the hard drives, everything that I'd worked on forensically, and then it was getting basically archived. It was getting replicated, and then passed over to law enforcement. And at that point in time, I thought, well, since I know this contains evidence of another organization, I actually contacted them for a third time. I read it almost 2.5 months later, after initially contacting them. And I said, hey, just to let you know that, my investigation's concluded, and I'm handing over the evidence to law enforcement, and it will contain information related to your organization. Immediately afterwards, I received a response that, yes, we had become a victim, and that they paid the ransom, and they didn't want anyone to know. And to this date, there still is no evidence of that organization ever being a victim. And it's a very large organization. So I think that scenario is very common, and it's unfortunately that we don't hear more about it, because I think it's really important that we become transparent and share experiences, because that's definitely it's the lessons learned that I'm sharing today. Hopefully, that others will be able to in the future prevent themselves from becoming victims.
Absolutely, and that's really where I'd like to leave this is kind of that that call to action to. Yeah, I don't know what we have to do to make it happen. It's great that individual organizations decide to share. There have been many great cases of that in the past. A lot of startups that had very transparent culture. The kinds of startups where they publish everybody's salary anyway. They talk a lot about business strategy and stuff like that. But yeah, we need to understand these things. To be able to make bigger steps forward. Absolutely.
So, yeah, for the audience, I will do a live demo of this at InfoSec World. So if you happen to get an opportunity to go to that conference and event, feel free to come to the session, because I will be doing it live. And I always enjoy that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the only way you could make it more real is if there was like a documentary crew present while you were doing the incident, and I would 100% watch that documentary.
Absolutely.
So, Joseph, thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Manny, thanks. It's been a pleasure. And for everyone, hopefully this is educational, and hopefully see you again in the future, and stay safe.
Maybe at InfoSec World. Sounds like it's going to be good. Yeah. All right. We'll be back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.